Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Cosmere Festival's End of the World Reading Club. And we're going to be talking about this book, Ian McEwan's Solar. This was picked by somebody in our community as our topic for today. So, as with the first meeting, I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then I'm going to look through the comments, hopefully respond to what you've said, and we can build up a bit of a good conversation together about what we're interested in talking about. Solar by Ian McEwan. We picked this book because partly it was one I had on my shelf, and somebody was jumped in straight away to say that they thought we should read this time. Now, it's not a science fiction book. It's not a fantasy book. So you might be thinking, what looks to be a science fiction and fantasy festival talking about it? I've got some justifications. I thought I'd start with those. Firstly, we're also a speculative fiction festival. That's an area of genre which I think is a bit murky, and the gap between science fiction and literary fiction, kind of mainstream fiction, you'd go to the fiction shelves in Waterstones or any other bookshop for, is a bit blurry. So I think this book sits maybe more towards the kind of fiction side than the science fiction side, but it is a book about science, and I think that is quite an interesting delineation. So I thought I'd kick off with a brief overview of Ian McEwan. This is the first Ian McEwan book I've ever read. I probably should read some more, and I think possibly after reading Solar I might do so. Ian McEwan was born in 1948. He did his qualifications, undergraduate, postgraduate in English literature, and was at UEA, that kind of big writing school in East Anglia. This is by no means his first book. I'm just checking my notes here. So his first kind of novel came out quite a long time ago, following a series of short stories. And then this book came out in 2010. So a really interesting time for its subject matter, kind of climate change. At the end of 2009, you've got the Copenhagen meeting, and it seemed to be quite high up in news media at the time, kind of climate change. So it was quite a topical novel when it came out. It was inspired by a variety of things. Ian McEwan, it seems, is friends with quite a lot of people that are interested in science, arts, humanities and climate change. Christopher Hitchens, but also Richard Dawkins, I think, is one of his friends. So he's got some kind of personal connections with this story, and also some track records in his previous writing, kind of writing about the balance between science and humanities, and also kind of including heavily researched concepts like this in his fiction. So this is, from what I understand, very on trend. You might have your own views on how that fits in with him. Please let me know in the comments whether that's the case. So, there's some other reasons why this was an important book that I thought we should pick. One of those, it's kind of a book about the end of the world, and this is supposed to be, after all, the End of the World Reading Club. Now, it's not necessarily an apocalyptic one, but it is a book that explores some of the issues that we're going through at the moment, and will be continuing to go through, and will be influencing fiction for the foreseeable future. So it's, if anything, a really good context for future novels, and I think there's books that we might talk about in the future where this could easily be like a prequel for, because of climate change and the impact it's going to have on the planet. So we are going to talk quite a lot about Professor Michael Beard in this. He's the main protagonist. Before we get into some of those details, I thought I would give you a bit of a brief summary of the plot in case it's been a while since you read it. There's going to be some spoilers in here. I'm not going to get into too much detail because I think in some ways the plot is less interesting to me than the themes and what happens, but it might help jog your memory if it's been a while. So the book is structured in 3 parts. The first part takes place in the year 2000, and Michael Beard is a kind of run-to-seed scientist. He's had a great idea when he was young. He's been resting on his laurels since then, and he's been kind of dragged into running this centre to look at options for combating climate change. So part 1, the year 2000, we're really looking here at a scientist who's kind of down on his luck and doesn't really have any purpose apart from living his life, making his money. His private life is an absolute mess. He's on marriage number 5, which is kind of falling apart. And the real action in this section of the novel is driven by the collapse of his marriage, the kind of weird, obsessive mindset he gets in. And then the introduction, as the part develops, of a young scientist who has tons of ideas, which are really interesting ones, which he kind of ignores and disparages and is not bothered by at all because he's in this slump. And at the very end of part 1, something very dramatic happens, and he's kind of left with the consequences of that. So part 2 takes us to 2005, and the impact of the events of 5 years previously. And what's been most important is that Michael has taken on board these ideas and run with them. He's kind of capitalised on somebody else's work uncredited, and he's suddenly blossomed again as a kind of active scientist. His private life is better than it was, although still pretty weird. But he's found a purpose again. He's become a kind of climate change activist, and partly because he thinks it's important, and partly because there's some money in it and some fame and prestige in it. And we'll talk a bit about him and his complex motivations as we go on. We should also think about about how this all kind of fits together, and the centerpiece of the second part, which is that he goes on this trip to the Arctic, something that mirrors a experience that Ian McEwan himself had. He went to go and see the Arctic and the impact of climate change. So Ian McEwan went as an arts and humanities representative, as a writer. Michael Beard is there as a scientist in a boat full of artists, and it's probably quite a pivotal moment. Particularly when we talk a little bit about those differences between arts and humanities and science and the interplay between them, he's got some really challenging views that maybe are modified and moderated by his experiences in the Arctic. Then in part 3, that's set in 2009, and it's the kind of end game for all of the experiences and the things that he's said and done over the past 9 years, coming to a head in New Mexico. And this scientific burst of energy is coming to a fruition with a test of a brand new technology which will revolutionise the world potentially and help fight back against climate change and solve a load of problems. So there's a potential for the ending to be triumphant and wonderful and redemptive, but it doesn't quite play out like that. So that's the brief overview of what happens. So I went into this book cold. I had no idea what it was about, apart from the description on the jacket, which is Nobel Prize-winning scientist, best work is behind him, compulsive womanizer, marriage floundering, his wife's having an affair, he's still in love. There's a freak accident, so he can save his world from environmental disaster. A story of one man's greed and self-deception, darkly satirical novel, showing human frailty struggling with the most pressing and complex problem of our time, which sounds very sensible and was probably the reason that I picked the book up and bought it, because I thought that was going to be quite interesting, quite relevant to what I was thinking about with the festival. But I had not really clocked on, I suppose, that it was going to be a kind of a comedy, I suppose. It's really interesting. The tone that it most reminded me of, if I can find the books on the shelf, I probably can't, was Neil Stevenson, who is an author that I absolutely adore. His novels are quite often jam-packed full of science, but they're also darkly funny. Quite often the main character can be a bit misanthropic and says a lot of funny things, but this probably takes it a bit further. In some scenes it's like a farce, and I think from what Ian McEwan's talked about and what maybe some of the other kind of book club people have talked about, this is a very deliberate ploy. Climate change is a really difficult subject matter to talk about. It's difficult to talk about in a way that isn't entirely preachy. We might have a discussion about whether we think that Ian McEwan was successful in doing that or not. But that was really that tone. So if you've read any Neil Stevenson, this might have jogged some memories of you of some of his work. If you haven't read any Neil Stevenson, you really should, because he's kind of one of those mind-blowing authors. So I've got plenty of kind of reflections to go through, and then we're going to get into potentially some talking points. So please drop some comments in, because it would be good to start to get a bit back and forth. And if you start writing them now, then I can respond to them when I get there. So that Neil Stevenson reflection was my first one. The other thing that was really apparent to me, particularly in that first part, is the authorial voice. This is kind of Michael Beard's first-person narrative. We see the world from his perspective, but McEwan plays an interesting game, I think, in that you also do get a sense, sometimes through Michael Beard, but also through the authorial voice, of what other people think of him. And that gap between one and the other is something that I think plays out quite a long way through the novel, and we'll probably also talk a bit further on about the gap between what Michael thinks of himself, what other people think of him, and also what we think of him in any moment, and how there can be quite a big gap between those three. I think there's also something in there about kind of man's fragile ego. Michael and a lot of the men in the novel are people who are definitely portrayed in a slightly characteristic way as men who are really fragile, and their sense of self is tied up with lots of complicated things, but they are kind of almost always on the brink of something going badly wrong, particularly our protagonist. And then there's maybe a parallel here with the capitalism's fragile ego relating to the climate in particular. And there's some scenes where Michael interacts with government, with business, particularly with business, where this is really apparent. Another kind of tie into that, I suppose, is that there's throughout here a strand of talking about quantum theory. This is where Michael has made his name as a young man, looking at Einstein and string theory and providing kind of clarity and simplicity. This is something as a scientist he's always striving for. Even in his personal life, he's kind of ending up with the opposite at all times. And that there's something there about quantum and quantum theory being that you can only really know what's happening when you observe it. And I think this is, especially in Michael's private life, this is what's happening. He doesn't really know what's going on until he observes it. He's got no kind of way of extrapolating any other data, and that's something that he really struggles with. I find that really interesting. Similarly, there's a lot of talk about M theory, and I wondered how accidental it was that the protagonist has a name that starts with M, when M theory is such a kind of big topic of conversation in part one for quite a good stretch. I wouldn't pretend to know much about M theory, but I think my views on it were that, his view and the women in his life's view of him and our view, it's all kind of tied up there to do with perception for me. I also found the novel to be a mediation or a meditation on urgency, something that I think I've struggled with over time, and I think we all struggle with. I think as society we really struggle with is feeling the urgency of climate change. And Michael himself, it needs a kind of dramatic moment to shift his perceptions and some self-interest. And this story is perhaps some thoughts on how we can get from where we are still, 10 years on from when this was published, where it doesn't feel urgent to enough people, particularly in government, to a situation where everybody does. Because Michael kind of makes that journey, and he makes it a little bit slowly, and he kind of makes it without realising. He's not a man that thinks he can change, but he does change some aspects of himself over the course of the story. So where do we have to pitch ourselves to get there? And something that I think really does tie in this novel to the festival, and what we're interested in, is that there's some gaps there, and there's some opportunities for fiction to talk about the end of the world scenarios and climate change, and to provide hope and to provide solutions. This is a novel through the science provides solutions. I think there's other novels which provide warnings, and we need to be thinking about how our literature and our media can help shape that narrative. I'm not sure Solar is entirely successful in doing that. Hopefully, again, we'll talk about that a bit in the future, but it's a start. So another little observation that I had. So in part 2 of the novel, Michael has an experience that probably felt quite outlandish 10 years ago, but now feels entirely normal, in that he says some pretty outrageous things about the difference between men and women, and gets called out for it, and is on the front page of the newspapers. And you might think, would a scientist ever end up kind of like a subject of gossip? But just a few weeks ago, as of recording, one of the government scientists' private life and the impact that had on their professional life made front page news, and they had to quit. So I think if I'd have read this 3 or 4 months ago, it would have felt quite outlandish as a plot, but now it feels entirely relevant and suitable. And in terms of my reflections, I think what I'll end on is some of those reasons why this novel perhaps feels more relevant now than it did when it was published, although I didn't read it then. Because the world has changed. So climate change looms ever larger. It's starting to hit the front pages of some publications anyway, with increasing frequency. There seems to be a growing acceptance in this country, at least in the UK, if not necessarily all over the world, that this is a real thing, but that people feel really powerless about what to do about it. Not necessarily that they disbelieve it, but that it's something that they've struggled to work out how they've got much agency. But it's also relevant for a couple of really interesting reasons. The first of those is that Me Too has happened in the interim. Michael Beard, as a old man in a position of authority who basically uses that for his own gain, his kind of creepy, sleazy attitude to women, his kind of misogyny, although he doesn't attack anybody, he's got some really challenging views which I think we can reflect on now, which we perhaps couldn't reflect on 10 years ago in quite the same way, because culture has moved on. And I think particularly interesting for me was thinking about what would have happened to him in part 2 with cancel culture, with this idea that people can be removed from public life if they transgress. It feels to me that Michael would be a prime candidate for people coming forward, talking about their experiences with him, and him ending up without a job and without much prospect. Now, I think there's some interesting ways we could take that train of thought in terms of how some powerful men in particular stay in their positions of power or move into new roles, and that's kind of hinted at perhaps after the Nancy Temple scenario. But yeah, a really interesting novel to read in 10 years on. I think it's kind of aged. It's maybe not aged well in terms of that kind of sexual politics and wider culture, but also is interesting because of that, and perhaps has an added relevance and some layers that didn't have originally. So the other thing that I think makes it quite interesting this year, as ahead of any other years, is the interplay between what is urgent science and what isn't. So Michael Beard, to some degree, had made his fame in a non-urgent branch of science for the public at large, the science of light and kind of theoretical superstring and all the rest of it. There's that, and then there's the climate change, and these are, the climate change then becomes an emergency for him. We're living in a world where the climate change somehow has become not the emergency, not somehow, it's become not the emergency. So how do you still tackle something that doesn't feel as urgent as a pandemic, whilst also sorting out the pandemic at the same time? And I think there's been some interesting conversations in the media about how everybody being at home and not driving their cars, and not being out in the streets, has shown that nature is out there, and it's all really obvious. But by the same token, where do you spend your resources and your time and your energy if people are going to die now versus dying in 100, 200, 1,000 years, or there are people that are dying millions of meters away from where you are, hundreds of meters away from where you are? I find that balance really interesting. So I've got some talking points that I thought I'd drop in. So let's see how we go. So firstly, I want to get your views on rethinking the story after the past 10 years. Me too, particularly with climate change as well. The last year's climate action towards the end of the year, and Greta, and it being a lot more of a mainstream occupation than it was perhaps even 10 years ago. Does the story feel old? Does it feel, everyone's going outside all the time and talking to everybody, so right now it's going to feel quite dated compared to what people's experiences are. But yeah, how does that feel to you? The second thing that I wanted to talk about, or that we might want to talk about, is the tone of this. So is this a comedy? Is it a tragedy? Is it a farce? We'll perhaps come on to some hilarious stories that we'll get into as we go through. So also I was interested in talking about the voice of this. So this is mostly a kind of first person narrative, but I don't think it's quite that. I think McEwan's found this interesting voice, and this may be a voice that he writes in a lot, where it's kind of Michael's view on it, but also it's external to him at the same time. There's a kind of godlike, knows everything. Sometimes we do get a sense of what's in other people's minds, although most of the time Michael's trying to figure it out and doing very poorly. So when this came out, do you think Michael Beard would have made a more likely sympathetic character? Kind of going back to this talk about how culture has evolved, and the difference between somebody who's sympathetic and pathetic, because I found him to be, personally, a not very sympathetic character at all. I think some people probably do. I found him bewildering, I have to admit. I think he's written to be pretty bewildering, but I really struggle to have sympathy with him in almost any context. Also, it would be great to know out there if anybody in the comments can speak to the science involved in this. There was a really interesting review on The Guardian by somebody who was credited in the book, a scientist, and it's a bit of a strange one because they were credited in the book and they kind of met with Ian McEwan, so I don't think they were necessarily going to rip apart the science, but yeah, does anybody know how accurate it is? Because I've got no idea. So we've had our first comment from Kate. Yeah, I think he is pathetic. And I don't know whether that's shifted over the last 10 years because of how we consider people's behaviour. I don't know whether 10 years ago we'd have thought, well, he's a great man of science and, everybody has flaws, but it's worth it for the right thing. But I read him as a really, really pathetic man. I also wondered whether Michael Beard reflected Ian McEwan's view on UK science versus the US or other parts of the world, particularly in part one, as a kind of sleeping giant. So somebody that's got all the tools, but not necessarily all of the support for the right things or the energy to do the work that's required. So it'd be good to get your thoughts on that. I think we really want to talk about the ending. So that pinned comment in there of this blog post, there's a summary of the book's ending, if you've forgotten how it ends. The story has moved on. They're all in New Mexico. All of Michael Beard's chickens have come home to roost. What he did when the incident happened with the young scientist at his home, what he did with the research afterwards, the 2 women that he's running in different countries. I mean, his attitude to honesty and relationships and women is just unbelievable. So he's got a melanoma on his hand that he's had diagnosed and knows needs to come off, but he just can't be bothered to get it fixed. He's being sued by his former boss because he's stolen research that was done under the auspices of the centre. The father of that man is bringing that he stole research from is bringing charges of theft and fraud. The guy that he framed for murder is there and has probably just smashed up all of his product that he was going to change the world with and save the world. And his business partner is suing him because he's put their business in the tank. And then right at the end, his 2 lovers arrive at the same time in the same place. He's been keeping them across the Pacific, and suddenly they're there and he's got to deal with it. I feel like I should just point out, watching myself on the stream, my hay fever started, so I am going to be rubbing my nose. I'm really sorry about that. I'm going to try and not sneeze. But yeah, the suffering has begun for this season, so I do apologise for you having to see me rub my nose every 5 minutes or so, or a bit less. So anyway, back to the end of this novel. There's a really there's something that loops its way through part 3 in particular, is that you really feel like Michael Beard's heart is going to give out at any moment. I mean, I'm surprised the novel didn't end with him having a heart attack. And I'm not entirely sure that that's not what happened. So right at the very end of the novel, the lovers come into the diner with his daughter that he kind of likes but also doesn't like. And yeah, it's... is he having a heart attack? His heart is skipping a beat and swelling in his chest. Is it love? Is it a heart attack? I'd love to know what you think. So we've got another comment here. I'm just going to get it up in full. So I'm going to read it out so you can all see it, particularly if you're watching the stream back afterwards. I felt that the book showed how much man/character takes over from the actual science. Here is an essential issue in science, and yet it's the depraved man who becomes the focus, who uses it for his own ends, subsuming everything else. Through Beard we can see everything wrong with society, whilst also bring up issues of class, sexism, and waste. And then a smiley face, yeah. There's a lot there to unpack. There's definitely a discussion by Mcewan through the novel of the interactions between science and human beings. Michael Beard professes that science is this pure entity untainted by humanity, and there's a kind of set piece discussion he has with Nancy Temple that ends up with him being on the front page and his private life being raked over the coals, where the argument is that all of science is a social construct, and Beard's view, and I think to some degree maybe Ian McEwan's view from some of the things that I've read him saying, is that, or some of the reviews anyway, is that there are things that are pure in science and equations are pure in science, and that you can't socially construct a gene. I'm not entirely sure exactly where I fit on that in terms of the double helix or quantum mechanics, but I definitely agree with Kate that you can't pretend that science is a pure and entirely rational medium. If you look at climate change science in particular, how much it's the conversation about it as well as some of the science is loaded with people's assumptions. Quite often the criticism of climate science is that it's people just looking to get rich quick. I'm not sure whether the people that say that kind of thing would be validated by reading Solar. I'm not sure if that was Ian McEwan's intention, but I certainly got that vibe. And kind of more broadly about science, I think he does represent everything that's wrong, and the not necessarily in the climate side of things, because he's doing some really important work, but just in the other ways that he interacts with the planet and the people around him. It's all from his perspective. There's no empathy for other people. There's no understanding of other people. It's very solipsistic, I think. And I don't know whether this is McEwan wanting to get that critique of science in there, whilst at the same time still treating the climate science seriously. So he's trying to do the two things perhaps in parallel. So it'd be great to know what you think. Another really quirky bit is the passage that's about the unwitting thief. So this is a really funny story in the novel where Michael Beard is on a train. He's got some packet of crisps that he's bought in the airport shop. He's on the way back to his house, and he sits on the train opposite this guy that he's not quite sure about, and then he starts eating the crisps. The guy starts eating the same crisps. They kind of do this all the way to the end of the packet. Then he gets increasingly annoyed, thinking this guy's eating his food. He picks up the guy's water and drinks it, and then when the train stops, the guy gets up, hands him his suitcase. He walks off, and as he gets to the platform, he stops and realises that his packet of crisps is in his jacket pocket. And he tells this story then at a conference as a kind of interesting anecdote that he manages to turn into something that fits his argument about climate change. And we have to then think, what's the point of this story for us, for the story? And then it also has this extra layer. So somebody comes up to him after the conference and says, listen, this is an archetypal story, you made it up, everybody tells it, Douglas Adams told it, loads of other people told it, so it didn't happen to you. And his argument was, well, it did happen to me because, I was there, it's my life, what are you on about, stop being so weird. So this is something that Douglas Adams actually mentioned in one of his stories. I'm going to try and find it for you now, if I can. So Douglas Adams' take on it was that he used it in So Long and Thanks for All the Fish in 1984, and in an interview. And then he also then said, look, this actually happened to me. I was on a train, and for him it was a packet of biscuits and the crossword, and basically the same thing happened. Although the guy is ordinary. And he tells the story like it happened to him, but even for Douglas Adams, it seems to be that possibly the story was already out there, and he has used it in a story, then claimed it was his own experience, but it was kind of an urban legendy kind of story. So Ian McEwan is, I don't know, paying tribute to Douglas Adams, or is this just, and also making a witty joke, but I don't know, now I know all that, whether that kind of takes a little bit away. Is it too witty for its own good? But what that does lead us into, I suppose, a discussion about the use of ideas and when they come from. Because one of those other strands through this book is the use of ideas, where they come from, and what can you take from people, what can you steal, what can you borrow. So Michael Beard has made his fortune, or his fame and fortune, kind of extending somebody else's idea. He's had some original thought, he's managed to get himself hitched to Einstein's name, he's won a Nobel Prize, which is all great, but he's kind of done this, and then nothing else, and he's kind of maybe he's almost waiting for the next idea that he can iterate on. He's not necessarily coming up with grand schemes for himself. He needs that starting point from somebody else. So does this mean he's less of a scientist and a mind, or not? Because throughout he's pilfering. The scientist whose work he steals, he also quotes him extensively. In this version of the book, that's page 153. The thing that jumped in my mind really was he's clambering over the bodies of giants rather than standing on their shoulders, quite literally in the case at the end of what happens at the end of part 1. But yeah, he's this idea of where does all this fit in together? So we've got another comment here on the link. I think it's really interesting that there's a kind of story within a story within a story. How much is truly original thought today? How much are we iterating on other people's work? And I think Ian McEwan is maybe doing that on purpose. Maybe this is something that we're reading into this potentially. But yeah, it's a really interesting thing, I think. I'm just having a quick check through my notes now to see where my next bit is. So the other big thing I thought we might talk about is the link between Michael Beard's health and the planet's health. So Prof. Beard is a man who doesn't look after himself. This is something that happens all throughout the book. He starts off maybe a little bit overweight. And we learn through the story that his mother fed him a lot, and he perhaps equates food to a variety of things, but one of its biggest impacts is he just eats all the time. And if he skips a meal, he just keeps on eating meals later and later. There's a really horrible translation of him from those early days in 2000 to what he ends up being in 2009. I don't know whether this was something that informed why he ends up in New Mexico, where McEwan says he's not the biggest person in the diner, but he ends up being incredibly overweight, skin cancer. He's got a ton of other issues. His body's kind of falling apart. And I don't know whether there is something problematic here or interesting here. So the problematic side would be this idea that he is a man who is sacrificing his own health and well-being for the planet, and that McEwan is saying this is something, listen, we maybe don't want to make the same kind of sacrifice of living in squalor and not looking after ourselves, but that he's kind of, that bit of his life isn't important, because the thing that's important is getting the work done. In this context, I mean, he's a man that lives for pleasure most of the rest of the time. But in his health sense, it's the planet's health versus his health. And the planet's health is the one that seems to be the priority for the novel, and potentially for Michael Beard as well. So it'd be good to know what you think about that in the comments. So one thing to carry on talking about Michael is he's not a hero. That's very clear. And he's not an anti-hero either. So what is he? He's a kind of non-hero, perhaps. I don't even know whether he considers himself a hero. He is a fascinating character, much as he's repellent in almost every aspect. I do find him fascinating. So please let me know in the comments what your view on him is, because I think that's something that's quite interesting. I'm going to let you have a little think about that and perhaps write something. I'm going to check through my notes to see what's next. Perhaps we'll come back to talk about the ending. So it'd be good to know what you think about the ending. I am definitely one of those readers that likes a conclusion. So to some extent, I didn't like how open-ended it was, because I wanted to well, the the climate changey person in me wanted him to succeed. So perhaps the end of the novel suggests that Ian McEwan is very pessimistic about the future of our planet, and that it's just not going to work. It's not going to happen. We're not going to find that fix, because human nature is going to get in the way and sabotage our best efforts, and that perhaps they're Torpin coming in and smashing things up. In a way, this is Michael Beard's life, and the way he runs his life he's self-sabotaged his project, because he's almost set it up to fail, and the problem has been it's just taken so long to fail that we don't necessarily make that connection. The other thing that I think is quite interesting is that we don't quite know where his character's got to. Kate's chiming in that he's definitely a non-hero. Yeah, maybe we need to coin a new phrase. I'm not quite sure. Maybe he's just a beard. Maybe that's a beard hero. But yeah, so he's Michael Beard as a character is very clear that people don't change, people don't improve or anything like that. I'm not sure that's entirely true in his case. I think even as someone that you don't end up liking, even at the end, he does modify himself slightly. I don't know how much that is that he just ends up in a situation with two partners who genuinely care about his well-being and are prepared to stick around even though they know he's not very nice. So yeah, it'd be good to know what you think about his journey and his progression. But that does lead me on to something that I did really want to kind of get into, I suppose, is his view of himself, the people in his life's view of him, and our view of him. So to start with Michael's view of himself, he's honest to some degree about his failings, which I think is quite interesting for somebody that's so very flawed. He does have some self-awareness. He doesn't necessarily have a lot of awareness for other people, not in a way that's feeling. And he's very analytical about everybody all the way through. But I think even when he's doing things that are really weird and not very nice or very good, he's stepping outside of himself to see that these things aren't very nice or very good. I'm thinking in particular about part one, where he's struggling with the feelings he's got for his fifth wife. She's kind of having affairs and ignoring him. They're living in the same house. It's very difficult, and he's becoming obsessed with her. But he kind of knows he's being obsessed with her. He knows that it's ridiculous. So that's his view of himself, I think, is that he's a man that is capable and knowledgeable, but also he's a man that's just ridiculous and a failure. And those two things maybe do exist for him. Maybe this redeems him slightly. Not as an anti-hero, he's still a non-hero, but maybe there's a little bit of redemption there for him, that he knows that he's horrendous. And then there's the women in his life, and I find this absolutely fascinating. And it's something that I think is maybe a bit, not troubling for me, but I think made me feel a bit uncomfortable, is that this kind of trope of older men who are successful and therefore attractive to women, because I think that's something you see a lot in fiction, and there is definitely something there between the interplay between attraction and power in life, in society. But it has a particular relevance and a particular interest for me, because in my day job I work in an academic institution, and this is where, to some degree, Michael Beard is operating, although his relationships don't happen necessarily in that context. So what this book isn't necessarily is a exploration of the dynamics of relationships and power in academia, but I think there are some parallels between the two that I don't know whether the author is knowingly interrogating or whether that's something that I'm bringing to this. But I found that quite uncomfortable, that he seems to be a big hit with the ladies. The kind of the worse he gets, the kind of he he treats the women in his life absolutely terribly, almost across the board. He's never engaged, he's never interested, he never says I love you, and these women all want to fix him and stick with him and tolerate him. It just doesn't feel very, very, very healthy for anybody in this context, particularly some of those women who seem really lovely and are deserving of something far more than they're getting from this man. And then there's our view on him. So I suppose I'm putting across here my view of him. I don't think Ian McEwan's written him to be a sympathetic character, although I think he maybe tried to pitch him as somebody that has some sympathetic elements, and you kind of want to believe in him because he's trying to save the planet, whilst at the same time kind of going, oh, but what a horrible man he is. But there's a disparity there for me between those three, and I wonder if that's a flaw in the novel for me, is that it's, although this is kind of a comedy and a bit of a farce, there's an issue of a believability about it, which maybe just takes me out a little bit of the story. So when your comments pop up about that, I will respond to them. I'm also interested here about the science aspect of this story. So something I think I'm quite sensitive to, and I'm not alone in this, is the info dump. And this novel, I think, to some degree does quite well at not having too many info dumps about the science. There do tend to be interactions between characters. I mean, they do tend to be between men and other men, or maybe a man and a woman, where things are explained or extrapolated on. And there's definitely, in part one, lots of the kind of theoretical physics, which kind of almost feels a bit like Ian McEwan showing off his reading. But there are some specific sections which feel a bit info dumpy for me, or a bit polemical. And I don't know if they quite ring true in Michael's voice. So the big prime example, again, looking at this paperback edition, is pages 148 to 154. So this is Michael's speech to a room full of investors to persuade them that the money needs to go into solar rather than oil and gas because various reasons. Now, I do think McEwan is upfront about the fact that his motivations are complicated, because he is interested in the climate change side of things. He's kind of become a bit of a convert, but he's also interested in making money. He's got all these patents, he's got this business that he's working on, so he wants to persuade them so he can have loads of cash. Although what he would spend this money on, I have absolutely no idea, because I guess just food, just packets of crisps in bulk. He'd have been fine for the lockdown. He'd have had a stockpile in. And he's growing his own food on mould in his flat anyway, right? So this is like 6 pages of Ian McEwan giving his view, or maybe him and his friend's view, on the importance of climate change and the logical, rational reasons why we should be tackling it. Now, I didn't disagree with, I don't think, anything in that. I've probably said a version of those words to people in a variety of contexts over the last 10 years or so, maybe a bit longer. But it stood out to me. It wasn't necessarily as subtle as I'd liked. I think maybe if it wasn't there, he would have had to find some more awkward ways of fitting it in, but I just don't know whether it stood out a little bit like a sore thumb to me, ahead of some of the other aspects of the story where it fits quite nicely. And to hark back to one of the first things I said, Neil Stevenson, something he's very successful in, I think, is making the science integral to the story. So a book like Cryptonomicon, which is about a variety of things, including physics and cryptocurrency. The cryptocurrency side and code breaking fits in with what the story is all about. I think this book, Michael Beard could have been a scientist about anything. He could have been fixing a horrible pandemic and finding a vaccine. He could have been solving a whole host of problems So I don't know whether the climate change side and Michael's story are thematically linked. We've talked about some of those links already, but also they're a little bit bolted together, and Mcewan needed a story that was an excuse to talk about climate science. The other thing then to do with that climate science, and Michael in particular, that I don't think is useful, and we touched on this previously, is that one of those narratives about climate scientists is that they're in it for themselves. This is definitely picked up in the book, the criticism of the centre in particular, the experimental place that Michael signs up for the cash and his name on a thing, and then ends up being interested in eventually, and its ideas of solving climate change. But one of those criticisms is that scientists are in it for themselves, and to too much of a degree, I think Michael is in it for himself. Now, I don't know what you think. Is there two sides to this coin? There's the theoretical research side, and Michael is a theoretical researcher essentially, and then there's the practical application side of things. Now, he might, although when he gets to New Mexico, he says in the narration or in the story that he's not the practical ideas man, he's the figurehead who comes with the idea and everybody else solves it. I'm not sure that's entirely true, because he is interested in the practical application. He's interested in the money of it and the getting it done side of things. He's not just somebody sitting in an ivory tower writing papers and then getting on to the next thing. But he is also a man completely and utterly of self-interest. Now, I don't think it would have been a better story if the scientist at the heart of this had been a traditional hero, or even an anti-hero who was trying to fix the planet. But I also don't know how helpful it is that he's such a flawed character at the heart of this, and he's supposed to be representing humanity's approach to this. Oh, sorry, Kay, I'm just scrolling down. So we've got some comments, so I'll head to those and then back to my thoughts. So Kate says here, I like the use towards the end of the book to pass it off as love, which sums him up well. Absolutely, he's quite sociopathic in a way, in that he doesn't necessarily do very well at passing off as love. I'd love to know what the other characters think about whether he loves them or not, whether it's a thing that he just can't say, or that it's a thing that he can't do. Because also you think, well, why is he doing this for the planet? Because he doesn't love anything. He loves food. My favourite phrase, which I might use, is favourite word, pre-hungry. He's going to eat because he knows he's going to be hungry in an hour. I mean, we've all been pre-hungry. So I'm definitely keeping that one. But yeah, there's his relationship to relationships is a really tricky one. One thing that stood out in my mind at the end of the story is that there's a section where he talks about a woman in his life, I can't remember which one, who is, it might be, I can't remember, it might be Melissa, but he's saying that there's all this thing about how her feelings are tied up with her experiences that she's had previously, and Michael doesn't really believe in that because, that's just all nonsense, you are who you are kind of thing, but he is very much tied up into the experiences that he'd had as a young person and his parents. So much as he doesn't believe in some of those theories, I think maybe Mcewan's saying, well, there's some justification to them, he just doesn't necessarily see it. Science for him is things you can plot on a graph, and life for him to some degree is things you can plot on a graph, and everything else is a little bit alien. So we've also got a comment. I noticed in a few of Mcewan's books, the chunks of scientific explanations didn't seem to fit. It seemed a little bit pretentious, especially if you look at other writers. He's a clinical writer, though, I think, and maybe the science represented that in a way. Yeah, I don't disagree. Having not read his other work, I couldn't comment on those, but yeah, maybe there's something of Michael in him, in that he is quite clinical about everything. The relationships are clinical, and the the analysis of Michael to some degree is clinical, and the science is definitely clinical. We haven't talked yet about the episode in the Arctic, and maybe this kind of ties into it. So the episode in the Arctic is quite funny. So Michael is on the way up there. There's that extended scene where he tries to go for a wee in the cold, and it gets stuck in the zip, and then he thinks it's frozen and fallen off, but it's okay. But he then can't do anything with anybody and be his normal creepy self with the women on the boat. There's a whole section there which some of the other kind of reading club guidance has talked about with the boot room. So Michael struggles because the boot room, which is where they all keep their stuff when they come on board the boat, gets really messed up and disorganised. It's perhaps there to reflect that humanity itself gets things muddled up and organised despite the best of intentions, and that even scientists, when they think they're being ordered, help contribute to the chaos. But I mean, this is just Michael at home. When he talks about his flat and his home life, he needs someone to tidy up for him. So is he the planet in this context? Does he and the other people up in the Arctic represent humanity, and somebody needs to come in, sweep up, clean up, look after him like Michael gets in his private life eventually? I don't know. But maybe there's some things there in his experience in the Arctic. So the reason why Kate's comment made me think of that was that Ian McEwan went for this trip to the Arctic. So this was a personal experience for him, and that in some ways maybe that's the warmest bit of the novel, because Michael's got friendships. He has got relationships outside of his romantic ones in the novel. And you do think that his relationship with Toby, his partner in New Mexico, there's a moment where, they're in the car and they're just having a chat and whatever, and he says, this is what friendship should be. But there's a different tone and a different texture to the relationships that Michael manages to form on that boat. For the only time, I think, in the novel, he seems like he's part of a community. There are a community of people that are very much not like him. There are a community of people that he's otherwise quite sniffy about in the novel. And perhaps that's borne out the fact that Ian McEwan's bringing something of his own personal experience to the story. He's not being clinical. He's not kind of constructing bits of story to get across the polemical ideas that he's interested in. He's bringing his humanity to the story just in this one spot. So maybe there's a nice parallel there, that this is the only point in the novel really where Michael lets go of being this kind of lecherous, only looking out for himself man, and for the only time in his life really people seem to respect him for him, not because of what he's done. They kind of don't care about the science really. They care that he's helping out, and he's having conversations, and he's making human connections outside of what's just in it for him. I mean, he's still drinking like a fish. I'm really surprised at no point there's not an intervention for him in this novel, because he's got to be an alcoholic. But yeah, there's something there about that's Ian being not clinical in that specific setting, and maybe that's because he's writing more as himself than he is as Michael. Let me know what you think about that, Kate, when you do your comments. There is some other stuff I think we haven't talked about yet. So leave in the comments any views you've got that you think we should have a chat about. There's obviously a delay between the writing and me talking, and then the more writing, but hopefully that's working out for people commenting. I'm just having a little look through my notes to see if there's anything else, and I'm also just going to check out the that link that I've pinned to the thing, because I think there's some really interesting comments there that we can get into. So in the comments, we've talked about kind of a lot about Michael, but not necessarily about the world he's in. it felt very real to me, the world. And there's a lot of detail there. There's a lot more detail about dance. We have a comment. I shall come back to dance and the world. So Kate says, really good point about the Arctic scenes. That bit was really well written. With regards to the changing room area, also we're seeing that a little with COVID. The right thing to do is to wear gloves, masks, etc., but we're adding an unprecedented additional amount of waste to the environment. We as humans never seem to be able to find balance. Yeah, and Mcewan talks about that a little bit, the disparity between the fact that these he doesn't say privileged, but I think I'd bring privileged artist and scientist are flown up to the Arctic. They're on really inefficient, guzzling mechanical vehicles like snow ski things to get there. If they see an animal, a wild animal in their natural habitat, they're going to shoot them. It doesn't say they're going to tranquilize them. I think they're just going to shoot them. So they're bringing the worst excesses with them. There's no need for them to have all that much wine. I know they're on a boat for ages, but they're bringing, even though their intentions are great, they're still bringing waste and they're bringing bad things up there, and they're not managing their resources collectively. So there's definitely a parallel there, and I do wonder whether that's something that Ian observed when he was there and saw as a little bit of a disparity. And I almost wonder whether this was drafted when he was there. I haven't read anything to say either way, but that was an observation that was noted. That actually this is an important. This can be a useful scene because you can get into some of those issues. And the pandemic at the moment, the amount of disposable things that humanity needs just to stay alive. Where do you find that balance to make sure that we're all around to fix the planet afterwards? Really tricky. And this novel maybe inadvertently lets us think about that now, even though we couldn't do before. So I shall move on to balance, but come back to that if we need to. So thinking about the world building, it did feel like a kind of real world to me. I think some of those, some of the politics and research in academia, even though I'm not a researcher, I can see some of those things nicely reflected. And I did enjoy the kind of, even though someone might have to explain to me the relevance. I did enjoy the detail of the dance shop in particular. What's fashionable, what's coming. I like that Melissa is a very organised and practical person. She's maybe a good counterbalance to Michael because she's level-headed and calm. She can organise her personal and private life and run a business in a way that isn't going to end with the end of the world when she fails. But it's also a lot of detail that feels like it could have been cut and the story would have been just as effective. So it'd be good to know your thoughts on maybe what that stuff represents. So I'm just going to go back to that blog to see what some of their talking points might have been. And one of those is, and the questions it asks here are, in what ways is Solar a satirical novel? What are its main targets? For example, how do postmodernists come off in the book? And we did touch on this a little bit before, talking about Nancy Temple and the social constructs of science. I hadn't heard of post-structuralism, I have to admit, or social constructivism, I should say. It feels to me that Ian McEwan's very sniffy about some of these things and about some of those aspects of gender theory. And again, one of those things again where I can't quite figure out the gap between Michael and Ian is that whole section. Is Ian critiquing a certain view where science can be rational and pure, and that physics is something that men tend to do because women aren't interested in it, and that this kind of pure reason is out there for the motivated, gilded few to find. Would it have been a more interesting story if the young scientist whose ideas he still had been a woman? If they'd been a woman that worked at the centre, or in any of these contacts? It's such a male-dominated world in terms of the characters we actually meet. And maybe there's something that's just occurred to me there, is that when Michael talks about female scientists in the story, there's somebody who is in Sao Paulo, that like this lifeboat if his life gets too bad. He doesn't talk about them as, although he might mention they're good scientists, that's not why they're mentioned, and they're never brought into the story as collaborators. There's two spheres for Michael in his world. In the world that we see in the story, there's the women of his private life, and there's the men of his professional life. So it'd be good to know what you think about that balance, and whether that's something that's deliberate, or if McEwan's essentially writing the observed world and that's not part of his satire. I think it would be part of my satire, and I don't know whether that the section with Nancy Temple, where people are having those conversations about who should be doing science and who shouldn't, hints that he's being satirical. One of my actions to myself is to have a chat about this with some of those people that work in science communication, because I know a few of those through my work contacts, to see whether they've read this and what they think about those passages, because there's definitely challenges there, working with the public and popular science, and perhaps some of those things reflect conversations that Ian McEwan's had with his friend Richard Dawkins and others about how that all fits together. So it'd be good to know your thoughts. So there is a comment on here about on this blog about the boot room aboard the ship. So the question it thinks we should be asking ourselves is, what is the significance of the entropy in the boot room on board the ship that is holding the conference on climate change? What does this chaos and carelessness suggest about humanity's ability to stop global warming? And we've kind of touched on that already, I suppose. I'm not sure entropy is the word I'd use. And is it noticeable that at the end there is a bag full of lost property, so everybody does leave and end with the same stuff? Does the boot room represent the planet, or does it represent Michael's life more, or is it a little bit of both? And I suppose that taps into that broader thing about whether Michael represents the planet or not. And he might well do. The character of Michael is frequently only concerned with itself. I've just seen a comment from Kate. There's a lot to take in and think about. I hope that that's what we can do in this service. Please do watch this back afterwards and send me comments, because I'd love to continue this conversation. And maybe in the comments when we post the video as well, because I'd like to keep these conversations going after the live stream is finished. We've got about 20 minutes left, so plenty of time for you to process your thoughts and add them into the conversation. So Michael as planet, I suppose. I mean, he seems to be aiming to be the size of a planet by 2020. But yeah, his mix of chaos and rational thought, his kind of his inability to really love deeply the things around him. We might find there some parallels between him and our attitude to Mother Nature. I'm going to say at the end of this stream what next month's book is going to be, and I think that is a theme that we might start to take forward into the next book. I'd love to know your thoughts on whether Michael is supposed to represent the planet and the kind of people on our planet, and the way that we interact as a global society, and as individual societies. And if so, maybe there's some hope there. Michael has his moment where he changes his mind, and he has his moment where he manages to fix things, and fix things in terms of his views on climate change. He makes that step. So maybe, although you can read the smashing of the solar panels and the collapse of Michael's life to be a pessimistic view on what Mcewan thinks the planet's going to happen to the planet, the fact that Michael has made that change, if he's kind of supposed to also be humanity and the planet, then maybe there's some hope that as a society at large we can act before it's too late, and we can act with positivity and enthusiasm. And there's not many aspects about Michael's life where he's positive, but he seems to be genuinely engaged in the idea of making this new technology and helping fix the planet. We're not going to talk about iron filings. I don't want to get into it. So we're going to kind of head back round, I suppose, in this kind of rambling conversation to talking about the public infamy side. That's the next thing on this blog's reading list. So the blog comment is, several times during the course of the novel it appears that public infamy, so born of journalists' insatiable desire for controversy and Beard's kind of self-destructive tendencies, will doom his career. So what enables him to emerge from these disasters relatively unscathed? And the question it poses is, will he be as lucky getting out of the mess he's created at the end of the novel? And what this is probably a really well-timed comment from the chat. So Kate says, he does remind me of a fair few male academics I've encountered, but taken to extremes. I think he resents much that is bad in the world in some ways. He represents a number of the deadly sins. Can this be said when considering science? And since he seems to believe himself to be a human god, he shows how even hopes of survival ties to the worst that will be surviving. We'll definitely dive into that in a second. And maybe there's a good transition we can make here. So I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier about cancel culture and maybe the way that society has evolved over time in the last 10 years. I don't know whether Michael would have survived scandal in the same way now as he could have done 10 years ago. And I think that's probably quite accurate. He'd have survived 10 years ago. I think that there's allowances have been made in the past for clever people who do bad things, because it's seen that their contribution to society is so great that it's worth it, but also that society has a short memory for scandal, or has had a short memory for scandal, and there maybe haven't been outlets for people that have got grievances or things they need to share to keep that in the conversation. Michael here, he escapes many times because people just stop talking about it and they move on to the next thing. So Mcewan's got that critique there of the short-termism, and that probably then ties into this idea of the short-termism of an urgency of climate change versus other things. So I'm just going to pull up. So I'm really fascinated by Kate's comment about the 7 deadly sins. It's not something that occurred to me, so I think that's great. So let's have a little look at the 7 deadly sins. So for those of you that can't reel them off the top of your head, it's all going to depend on which ones you pick, but the historical modern ones are lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy and pride. Now, I think you've got a really good point here, and it's interesting, I think, that sense of the cross between the two. Lust, I mean, he's a lusty guy. There's some passages in the book that were really uncomfortable, definitely for me. He's a glutton, yes. Interestingly, greed is the one that I'm not so sure about. He's greedy for some things, but I'm not necessarily sure he's not greedy for power, and he's not greedy for money necessarily, although he wants his business to do well, and he's always taking his honorariums to kind of keep his income coming in. He's also generous with his money, I think. When he gets his 5th divorce, he wants to live that simple life. He doesn't want the money from the house. He's happy to be bought out or whatever. Money's not necessarily that big motivation for him. But he is greedy for other things. But I think they make under other deadly sins. He is very slothful. The amount of time he spends lying on a bed, not being bothered to change out his clothes, or anything like that is ridiculous. And we greet him in the novel in a very slothful phase. He's doing the bare minimum he needs to survive. The Wrath one is interesting. For a novel about somebody that's so passive, there's quite a large amount of violence in here, but it's all internal violence. I don't think he's necessarily... He is wrathful in that he frames somebody for murder, and his wrath is tied up with lots of other things, but he doesn't necessarily... It's all indirect in terms of what he does. He never actually goes and punches anybody, because he knows he'd lose, I think. Envy is... Yeah, we'll come back to envy, maybe the last one. Pride is very important, I think. His view of himself, his view of other people's view of him is definitely tied up with pride. So I think we've definitely ticked off at least 4 or 5 on this list. But I want to come back to envy. In particular, part 1, although it's I think the longest part of the novel, it's also the one that sets us up for the rest of it, like most kind of 3-act structures do. And there is a lot of envy in there. He is an interesting character, and he's somebody that sees the world around him and wants to be something else in it. But he also, and with some self-awareness, knows that he can't be. He's kind of... Yeah, I think I agree with Kate that he seems to believe he is a bit of a human god, but he's also one that thinks he's a flawed god. And this perhaps taps into that the narrative tone as well. But he seems to envy... He envies younger scientists with energy, I think, even though he'd never admit it to himself. He maybe even envies his 21-year-old self. He envies the energy and the possibility. He is always looking for things to be better and maybe looking at other people's lives to see if they're better. So I'm on board for this Deadly Sins theory, and I think you can make a good argument to me that he represents all of them. So I expect to see that essay coming in from Kate, if not somebody else, in the future, definitely. So we have another point from Kate here. You would think it's self-loathing, but actually it seems more as privileges, an expectation of what he deserves, which is a very human characteristic. And yeah, he's privilege really does tie into this. He's got a real sense that he's entitled to certain things, and I think this goes across his professional and his personal life. And then maybe this is where we loop back into that idea of the stealing of other people's research. He almost doesn't treat it as stealing, and that I thought rang really true in terms of the world around us and human beings. That there are stories we tell ourselves to justify things, and maybe the underpinning aspect of that is privilege. If you feel like you've got a privilege, then you can excuse your behaviour and the things you do, such as taking somebody else's research and presenting it as your own and being selfish about it, because you're the person that deserves it because you've got the most skills and experience and profile. You're the one that can make the difference, that can make the change. And if things happen to you that are negative, then they shouldn't be happening to you. or they should because you're flawed, but you should be able to get out of it because of who you are. And those bits are all bundled up together in Michael Beard. And I hope when you read this novel, you can reflect on yourself and the way that you interact with the world and the way that you measure your privilege against things. And particularly when we talk about climate change. So this blog, the very last of their 15 things to think about, I really recommend you check out this pinned link, because there's loads of food for thought in here, is what does solar contribute to our understanding of climate change? And maybe this is where we'll end, because we'll come back to that end of the world aspect to this. So, again, I wonder whether this is a novel of its time. This is a novel of 10 years ago. I think that a lot of the things that it's talking about in terms of climate change are maybe more well understood now than they were 10 years ago. Maybe they don't seem as novel as they were on the brink of that Copenhagen conference. But interestingly for me, I think what they represent isn't necessarily the science, but the psychology. And if there's something that those of us that believe we need to be more urgent about climate change can take away, is we can look at a character like Michael Beard, somebody that you would, at the start of the novel, think would never get on board with this. He's so against the very point of it. It's the only bit of his life, really, until maybe the end with his daughter, where he can take himself out of himself and look at the long view and care about the long view. How do we, as advocates for making changes, and the festival is definitely one of those, how can we pitch things? What psychological experiences and structures can we put in place that allow other people to make the same journey that Michael Beard made? And maybe this is Mcewan's point, that if Michael Beard can make this leap, then maybe anybody can, because he might be the worst human being in the world, or at least in the top 1,000. So if he can find a way to connect with global warming and climate change, find a way to link it to his own experience and see the importance of it, and act on it to make a change, and act on it in a way that's bigger than just being more responsible with your bottles, then that's useful. And I think what Mcewan does do in that specific context is make the point that nobody's perfect. I mean, the aim will be to better than Michael Beard, I guess. But not only that no one's perfect, but that there are always going to be trade-offs you make. Now, if I was going to criticise that understanding of climate change, one thing that the novel doesn't talk about is where the raw materials are going to come from for this wonderful solar project. Where does the glass come from? Where do the electronics come from? Where does the lithium come from? Because as we're starting to realise, global warming is an aspect of climate change and our responsibility to the planet. And maybe Mcewan doesn't dig far enough into the thorny interconnectedness of all those things, because we're if we carry on living the way we live, we're going to make bad choices no matter what. So it's picking which bad choices, or the least bad choices, we make. So we've got a final point from Kate here, I think probably a final point with 5 minutes to go. She says, yes, I agree with that. Also, climate change seems so logical to those who realise how urgent it is. This goes beyond that and shows the politics and complexity surrounding scientists. It's not just a question of science, it's a question of scientists as flawed humans with responsibility for this. So yeah, there's a lot in there to unpack. So I really recommend that you dig into this novel and think about some of those things. And if you're passionate about addressing climate change, then this novel might give you some pause for thought, and we can use Ian Mcewan's putting the opportunity he's given us to put us in the mind of somebody that struggles with it, and how they can get to a better point. I mean, what I wouldn't recommend is that you frame somebody for murder after an accident as a mechanism for bringing people on board for agreeing with climate change action, but maybe there's some other ways that we can take. So I think that's going to bring to an end our discussion. If Kate pops up another comment or somebody else dives into the comments, I'll try and cover that in the next 4 minutes. But what I did want to do was talk about next month's book now. What we've decided to focus on is this wonderful book. This is the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. There's a new book of hers that's out right now that I've not read. The 5th season is part 1 of 3. It was the winner of the Hugo Award in 2016. It is one of the best books I've read in the last few years. The trilogy is great, but 5th season in particular is wonderful. This was a book that I think, again, I was a bit like last month's book. I was bought as a gift, never heard of it, never read it. You could describe it as a fantasy. You could describe it as science fiction. I think that's something that we'll get into next month, is where this sits on that arbitrary divide. And it's just a brilliant book. So you've got a month or so to read that book, and if you want to dive all the way into reading all 3, you can do so. We're just going to focus on that first book in the reading club. I'm really excited that I'm going to reread it, and also that hopefully all of you are going to read it as well and come back with your thoughts. It's really interesting, really fascinating. She's a great voice on Twitter, if you want to go and check her out there as well, and engage with some of her ideas and her stories. This is somebody that I hope we can bring to the festival in the future, whether that's in person or digitally. So it'd be great to know what you think of the 5th season, and we look forward to seeing you in a month's time to talk about it here on the stream. As I said a little bit earlier, if you've got comments and you want to continue this solar conversation, that'd be brilliant. Stick them in the comments on Facebook. I'm also going to explore adding this to a YouTube channel. That's one of the reasons I've been reading out the comments, so that people can still get that content even if they're watching back afterwards. And yeah, it'd be great to hear what you think about Michael Beard, about his strange worldview, his pre-hungriness, and maybe what you think is the funniest scene. I think there's plenty of them in there. Maybe I'll try and end with one, maybe not. What I might end with is a little bit of a quote actually from the book. In the paperback, this is page 118. About his future lightness, he had made many general resolutions and virtuous promises. What defeated him was always the present, the moment of vivid confrontation. So this is something we all need to think about, is how do we either fight our human nature to make the long term urgent now, or how do we turn that long term into something that's urgent in the world we're in right now? Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this stream, and we look forward to seeing you next month to talk about the 5th season.